Professor Martin Watts, who, as mentioned earlier, was the joint author of the recently published macroeconomics textbook. Martin is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Newcastle University, New South Wales, and Research Associate of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity. He has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles in a broad range of leading international and domestic academic journals, and co-authored 16 book chapters. Martin has gained extensive teaching experience over his career, primarily in labour economics and macroeconomics. Welcome, Martin.
Right, well, thank you very much. Some of what I am about to say, Bill has covered to some degree, so I'm actually aware of the time, so I'm not going to talk too long, I hope. Okay, so I was given some fairly rough and ready guidelines as to what I should talk about, and I came up with this title for the talk a few days ago, and as I say, there's a bit of duplication with Bill. So first of all, by way of background, as Bill has said, mainstream neoclassical thinking is still dominant, but the development of MMT concepts started in the 90s with Randy, Bill and Warren, and the role of the post-Keynesian thought email discussion list. And I guess you can point to two fairly significant events in 1998. One was Randy's book, Understanding Modern Money, and also the beginning of coffee, and Warren was very supportive of that development at the University of Newcastle. And really, in the years that have followed, you've really got two centres of MMT. The first being UMKC, where Randy was, but has retired, but he's still involved, and a series of academics, some of who are on the advisory board, and they have got a critical mass, and they've produced graduate students who've gone on to teach MMT in a range of American universities. And then on a somewhat smaller scale at the University of Newcastle, Bill, of course, James Juniper, a colleague, and myself have been teaching MMT principles and using those principles in our research and graduate supervision. Engagement with orthodox economists at conferences and seminars in Australia became largely unproductive. MMT ideas were treated with some indifference, if not contempt. I guess most of the time people were fairly polite. Dialogue ceased in the early 2000s. I think it was 2002, Bill, when you asked the research director of the Reserve Bank as to whether a Reserve Bank cheque had ever bounced, and there was a pregnant pause, and somebody mentioned that...
Embarrassed silence.
That would be a better way of putting it. And then somebody started talking about inflation, in other words, the inference that the government was going to spend lots and cause inflation. There was also an uneasy relationship with post-Keynesian economists who, despite a lot of shared views, particularly about at least some aspects of the monetary system, had concerns about the exchange rate if you introduced a full employment policy, and equally the inflation ramifications. And they have a particular hostility to the job guarantee, which seems to persist. So despite their rhetoric, it's not clear that they really believe that full employment is sustainable. And I guess pre-GFC, there was some concern that an ageing and diminishing group of MMT aficionados would spend their time talking to each other, and the MMT message would really not get out. And of course, what did change the dialogue somewhat was, of course, the GFC and the realization that deregulated markets, particularly financial markets, didn't work for the betterment of all. And also post-GFC, of course, the total reliance on monetary policy, albeit there was some token fiscal stimulus measures about 10 years ago. That's created a lot of debate, and post-Keynesians have been part of that debate in terms of saying that austerity is not the way to go. In terms of the mainstream, of course, they have made few concessions. Their new monetary consensus does acknowledge that there is a role for fiscal policy under very specific circumstances. What is quite interesting is that mainstream introductory and intermediate texts have tried to maintain a monetarist foundation, that central banks are about controlling the money supply. But at the same time, they want to incorporate the insights about the modern monetary system and how the central bank actually doesn't target the money stock, it actually sets the interest rate. And myself and some colleagues did a very detailed review of 4 leading macro textbooks, and one has to conclude that they are totally incoherent, and quite how first-year teachers can actually make sense of these textbooks is hard to know. Of course, mainstream economists started talking about MMT. Krugman famously in the New York Times op-ed piece in 2011, subsequent articles through to this year. MMT ideas represented by Bill's blog. He mentioned that he started a blog. Randy didn't actually know what a blog was, I don't think.
No. What the F is a blog?
And that blog, and to a lesser extent New Economic Perspectives, has been very influential, and no doubt many of you present have read Bill's blog. Bill made brief reference to the sort of sequence of what happens when new ideas are introduced, largely ignored, and that was the case prior to the GFC, acknowledged but ridiculed. And here we have a couple of academics, well, Pally in the US, Ren Lewis in this country, who essentially say what's old is correct and what's new is wrong. In other words, MMT doesn't really add anything. And of course the somewhat hysterical discussion that's now going on, particularly in America. But recently there has been some quite sympathetic material, articles in relatively serious newspapers, even the Australian, strangely enough, which is a Murdoch publication. And of course the defining moment really was AOC starting to talk about MMT, which led to the condemnation which Bill made reference to at the beginning of his talk. And of course the Senate motion, which essentially was supported by Lawrence Summers, surprise, surprise, Janet Yellen, and a whole series of members of right-wing think tanks. But equally support for MMT from a range of individuals, including this financial character. Do you know him, Warren? Montier?
James Montier.
Yeah. Which is his blog is very good. He's very supportive of MMT, and he captures MMT in a very few words, and it's a fairly catchy title too. Okay, so that's by way of background. So I'm going to briefly talk about the dominance of mainstream economics. I mean, Bill also has already made some reference to that, raising the profile of MMT, etc., etc. So in an ideal world, in the university system that works in a discipline that is not dysfunctional like economics, you would think that the frank and fearless exchange of ideas would lead to some sort of progress in the paradigm. But there are serious vested interests at work in terms of tenure, promotion, general progression in the academic scene, and the prospect of other lucrative opportunities resulting from some profile. I also reflect on the issue of paradigm change, contradictions emerging in the paradigm, and how that leads potentially, at least according to Kuhn, to a crisis in the prevailing paradigm and the resolution of anomaly via a new paradigm. One may pose the question, well, if you believe Kuhn, you would think that economic thought is actually progressing, and so us mere mortals here are standing on the shoulders of giants of the past, and everything is moving forward. Well, unfortunately, it ain't as simple as that. And certainly, when you look at the responses to the GFC, policymakers had learnt nothing from the lessons of the Great Depression. One can talk about debates about philosophy of science. Milton Friedman just thought that theories should be tested on the basis of their predictions. He didn't realise that different theories could lead to the same predictions, which is observational equivalence. And more fundamentally, there has been this separation, this divorce, if you like, in terms of academic debate. The mainstream stay over here and we stay over here, because it's quite pointless in trying to engage with them. So, raising the public profile of MMT, well, obviously it's starting to happen. It seems to me it's quite interesting to think about the dynamics of the introduction of new ideas into the political domain. Do interest groups and public opinion drive the agenda and the politicians follow, or is it the reverse? And an example to me, and I could be accused of being wrong here, is that we had the same-sex marriage debate in Australia, where clearly activism, grassroots activism prevailed. And obviously politicians then get on board, but the activists drive the agenda. And it seems to me, in terms of MMT, the role of politicians is that much more important, because the ideas are intangible and counterintuitive, and unless you have politicians talking about them, then to really get some traction is very difficult. And the problem, of course, with most politicians is that they're careerists and they lack vision, and they're really unwilling to bite the bullet and articulate counterintuitive ideas. So the government is not financially constrained, when they believe there's a very high cost of doing that. And this sort of political cowardice we've certainly observed in Australia, and you've had dealings with the Greens, haven't you, Bill, with no positive impact in terms of their view about macro policy. So AOC, Alexandria Ortiz-Cortez, has played a very important role in the US. Political recognition of MMT, at least in the US, is a start. And one would assume that other politicians would now start engaging with the debates. And clearly there is a role for activism, not only engaging with politicians, but getting, if you like, the critical mass of the population to start embracing MMT ideas. And I won't presume to provide advice as to how that should be done as such. What is important is the nature of the MMT message which is disseminated. And we came across this sort of issue at the last MMT conference in New York. As I say, some of the mainstream media at least are giving MMT a run. At present, my perception is the UK debate, like in the US, is very superficial between academic economists. There's Pally in the US, who's frankly dreadful, very superficial. And what tends to happen is they don't really address the body of MMT work. They select a few papers or books or whatever, and they don't reflect on the fact that people are writing about MMT even in 2019. The UK criticism seems to be, well, it's obviously of our blogs to some degree. Portes, mainly Macro, which is Simon Wren-Lewis's blog. And there's been, as I understand it, significant Twitter activity, but I don't subscribe to Twitter because my life is too short. And also, if we're going to have a serious academic debate, a serious discussion, then Twitter is really totally inappropriate. And what I find interesting in respect of Simon Wren-Lewis is that he has not written a mainly Macro blog about MMT this year. So it's more subterranean in terms of using Twitter. Macro is difficult, there's no doubt. Like most disciplines, it is driven by concepts and principles. The fallacy of composition is very challenging. Theoretical models are very important. But developing a theoretical model, specifically in algebraic terms, does not give it credibility per se, because it is the nature of the assumptions, something that Friedman wished to ignore. So the really important thing in terms of the dissemination of MMT is to reflect on the fact that it is the current state of understanding is the result of many years of thought and interaction amongst MMT economists, and that for anybody who is pushing out the message, it's very important to understand the principles and not start uttering glib two-liners about government can provide for your every need. So, in very general terms, MMT incorporates chartalism and functional finance, but it's grounded in institutional practice. In other words, what central banks actually do, as well as what banks actually do, and how fiscal policy is constructed. So, Warren has touched on this. This is a rather more sort of formal way of talking about the fiat currency. It's issued by the state, it's a unit of account, it's got value because the state imposes taxes in that currency. And fiat money is money that the state has declared to be legal tender. Now that doesn't require legal tender laws, because if people are paying their taxes in the currency, then other transactions between households and firms and so on will also take place using that currency. Then we have functional finance, which goes back to Lerner and the notion that fiscal policy should be used to counteract economic fluctuations to secure full employment and price stability, and you can completely ignore the impact on deficits and accumulated debt. Institutional practice, as I say, refers to how these key institutions work, how they operate. And given that institutional practice is precisely what central banks and others say they do, it is really not theory at all. And you can go to the Bank of England website, you can go to the RBA website in Australia, and they'll tell you what they actually do. how they make sure that the rate they announce every month is the rate that banks lend to each other, how they engage in open market operations and so on. The idea of institutional practice, though, is somewhat nuanced, because there is a distinction between what MMT says about the capacity of the monetary system to operate, and indeed policy, and the fact that that countries impose voluntary constraints on the operation of certain aspects of policy. So, for example, major purchases of government debt on the primary market, in other words, when that debt is issued, the Bank of England doesn't go and buy a whole load of that debt. That is either outlawed or simply in practice doesn't occur in many countries. Not all countries, because Canada's a bit different. So it's very important to distinguish between talking in fairly abstract terms about MMT and the capacity of these institutions and how to operate in a particular way, and the way that these institutions in a particular country operate. And countries are different. And in writing the textbook, that has been a challenge, that institutional arrangements do differ across countries. So it's very important that MMTers are very clear about what they're talking about. Not are they talking in abstract terms, or are they talking about the operation of the US economy or the UK economy or whatever. And well, let me move on to the next. No, I'll go back. So if we're talking in fairly abstract terms, then it's important to realise that that currency sovereignty is highly important in terms of the capacity of the way the conduct of policy can be conducted. Now, currency sovereignty is very important because it refers to an economy with its own currency, so not a Eurozone country, operating with a freely floating exchange rate, and also, and this really doesn't apply to modern developed economies, not overexposed to debt denominated in a foreign currency. There's no reason for a country with its own, well, a modern developed economy with its own currency, there's no reason for it to acquire, or sorry, to sell foreign currency denominated debt. And if you have a country which satisfies those conditions, including the one about debt exposure, and Australia fits the bill very well, and the UK would as well, then of course monetary and fiscal policies can be focused purely on the domestic economy. So the external economy, and therefore trade and exchange rates, will be handled by the fact there is a flexible exchange rate. So in terms of engagement of MMT ideas with those who don't agree, these basic principles are of central importance. They really are the key building blocks. And in terms of when I read articles that are often critical of MMT, and I'm wary of the time, so I'll be quick, if the article doesn't talk about these principles, then as far as I'm concerned it's totally deficient. If you're talking about the operation of the macroeconomy in a particular country, you've got to understand what the institutional arrangements are. Okay, and a warning about, as I say, glib statements. You know, government can spend and buy anything that it wants, and you just set up your wish list. You know, get rid of student loans, more money in the national health, blah, blah, blah. There is a real resource limit on obviously what can be spent. Okay, the textbook. Well, I'll be very brief about this. Of course, the textbook joined a very illustrious stable of textbooks, including Mankey and Krugman. Guilt by association, I suppose, but hopefully not. It does represent the consolidation of the work that's been done over 20 years. It is pretty rigorous in terms of how it's developed. And let me just, I'm going to jump a few because I'm wary of the time. I'll just go to the content. The conceptual basis and theoretical basis of MMT is very carefully outlined. There's rigorous stock flow consistent modelling, and is adopted and illustrated by the use of balance sheets. There is a breadth and depth of analysis of competing perspectives. So it's not as if, although it's an MMT book, we ignore the alternative views, but we don't pretend to be pluralist because we understand how modern monetary systems work. Lots of reference to empirical evidence, including 3 major currency crises. History of thought gets a lot of attention, and contemporary policy issues in the last few chapters, which are obviously highly relevant. Teaching MMT, I won't go through all this other than to say that you need good students and committed students, and there weren't that many when I was teaching it at Newcastle. The good ones that one comes across, they become very excited with the ideas, and some of them obviously go on to postgraduate work, which is very rewarding. But the majority probably want to do marketing or some other major in their degree, and economics is simply too hard for them. Okay, final comments. We are making some progress in terms of getting traction. It is important that the ideas are represented appropriately in public discussion and discussion with friends in the pub and so on. I hope that the textbook is useful in assisting the transmission of the MMT framework to both students and interested public. You have to deal with initial disbelief. I don't know what percentage of you is still in the state of initial disbelief. It may be very few. So, well, you can assist in this process of the emergence and consolidation of MMT in the public sphere by reading the book and also recommending the book. And this is not supposed to be a sales plug for the book. It's supposed to be getting the ideas of MMT out. So, thank you very much.